thought it was about time to check back in with Marco. As you know, Marco Vigato is a regular here on Earth Ancients. He is a researcher, and he also wrote a really good book called The Empires of Atlantis, The Origins of Ancient Civilizations and Mystery Traditions Throughout the Ages. One of the reasons I just can't get enough of Marco is he lives in one of my favorite countries, which is Mexico. And it's literally surrounded with megalithic cultures that we have no understanding of. What we have is their buildings, pyramids, and temples left to us. And there's a huge question. Now, if you don't know who Marco Vigato is, he was in the Netflix Ancient Apocalypse Part 2. And in that program, Graham visits with him in central Mexico and talks about his belief on a number of areas that appear to be extremely old and continually used. And I thought that was a great program, and that was probably fun for him too. So, hey, Marco, welcome
Well,
to Earth Ancients. How you doing, friend?
hey, Cliff, it's always a pleasure to be here with you on the show. Thank you for having me.
Hey, let's talk about ancient apocalypse for a minute. I got an email from the producer Clem, and of course, I was a big advocate for you. And how much lead time did they give you prior to the filming starting? Did they give you like a few months, and did they ask you what sites were the most unique, or how did they come about developing that episode?
Yeah, it was a few months from the time they first reached out to me to when we actually went on the ground filming with them. It felt like they were still figuring out when they first contacted me which sites they were going to cover. And so that's when they suggested that we go to Texcozingo, which is this really amazing megalithic site in central Mexico, and Xochicalco. Then they also picked, of course, Cholula for another segment of the episode. And from that to when we actually went on the ground filming, I think some 5 or 6 months went by.
It was pretty quick then. Okay, so you made some suggestions. Of course, Clem is the producer, but she's not the expert. Who was the final decision? Was that Graham?
Yeah,
On
I do
on
think so. I do think so. So just
Okay,
thinking about what would fit well into the storyline, I think that the segment of Xochicalco, particularly with this idea of the global deluge and the myth of Quetzalcoatl, I think it fit very well with the narrative. It also connected with the other segment on Cholula, these legends of the giants rebuilding after a flood.
that's fascinating. All right, here's a question that I ask you, but I'm going to ask you again. You and by the way, for those of you listening, Marco just did a vacation where he was in Lebanon with his folks, and he was in the Middle East looking at megalithic cultures. When I ask you, Marco, what is the signature of these early civilizations? And let's just say that we don't know who they are, but what signatures do you use as an identifier of a culture that is highly sophisticated, but obviously is not around anymore because we don't have documentation of who they are other than the dwellings. So what's a signature of these early epoch civilizations?
I would say it's precision stonework. And I talk about stonework more broadly than just megalithic architecture, because I think there are also many objects that are not megalithic. You're probably seen those Egyptian stone vases, for instance, and there are many similar examples also in Mexico with jade, with obsidian. They are manufactured to a high level of accuracy, high level of precision. So I think that's what I consider their main signature. That includes, of course, precision, megalithic architecture, and megalithic engineering, as you find in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Peru, also in parts of Mexico, but also some of the smaller objects that suggest the use of what we may consider as a more advanced and perhaps still unexplained technology for carving these objects, moving the largest stones. So they have to pick one signature, that would be it. And the reason why it's stone and not other materials, I think it very simply comes down to the fact that stone can last for thousands, even tens of thousands of years. So it's much more logical that we would find evidence in stone than, say, for instance, metal or other objects that would be melted down or reused by later civilization. That's probably why stone is so widespread, why we find so much evidence, quite literally written in stone, of this civilization all over the world.
Stone, the megalithic stone is a good signature. I think when we spoke last, you're also suggesting in some locations, and this is perhaps in Mexico, that there's perhaps polymers that were created and used as a substitute or perhaps in conjunction with stone. Is that something that you believe is a possibility?
I think it's a possibility, but I don't consider myself to be a big proponent of the geopolymer hypothesis. I do think it's possible, but I haven't yet seen very compelling evidence that it was indeed the case, particularly with those igneous rocks like granite, diorite. It would be very difficult, if not impossible, to replicate with any geopolymer. I think there may be some other types of technology involved, like stone softening, for instance, but that's not the same as talking about geopolymer.
Right. Let's talk about your research trip. Now, you went to Baalbek, which is a fascinating place. I haven't been there yet. Of course, I need to get over there. When we look at Baalbek, we have this, I think it's called the Temple of Mars.
Temple of Jupiter.
Jupiter, excuse me. This is this famous temple that sits on a foundation of truly megalithic stones. And I would imagine that when you were there, you also went to the quarry and you saw these stones in situ, just about ready to be cut out and moved. But what did you feel was a similarity in the stonework there as compared to some of the places you've seen in Mexico?
I think it's, again, when you talk about precision megalithic stonework, so it's not only the size of the stones. In that Baalbek, you have some of the largest, if not the largest, stone blocks ever used in construction anywhere on Earth. So we're talking about stone blocks that weighed in the range of 800 up to 1,000, 1,600 tons for one of the blocks still lying in the quarry. But it's also the precision of how these stones were assembled. When you look at the Trilithon, which is this set of three massive monoliths near the Temple of Jupiter, it's not only the size of the stones is astonishing, but it's the fact that they're so precisely jointed and fitted together, you wouldn't be able to stick a sheet of paper quite literally between the stones. There are points or places where you can't even see the joints. So the idea that it could move such enormous masses and blocks of stone with the precision required to leave these hair-tight joints between them, that's something truly astonishing. That's, for me, one of the signatures of this ancient lost civilization.
What would you say is the, and this is for you to guess at or hypothesize, what would you say was the technology behind this precision? Because I know exactly what you're talking about when I visit Egypt, when I visit Mexico and other parts of Europe, these perfectly cut stones that are laid next to each other, and the precision is so great that you can't pass a piece of paper between the joints. What would you think would have been the technology? Are we talking Chris Dunn's hypothesis, huge cutting blades, or would you say there's something that's we're missing, the science and technology that's been lost?
Yeah, I think that certainly involved some mechanical method of processing and working stone. And there are many, I would say there is lots of evidence of that in places like Baalbek, for instance, where you see these very peculiar tool marks, saw marks in some cases. You find those in Egypt as well. Now, when I talk about mechanical methods, I don't necessarily mean high technology methods. There are a number of ways of cutting stones that would use technology that, even though it would not have been probably accessible to a Neolithic people, but that would certainly have been available to a Bronze Age, Iron Age civilization. There are many examples, for instance, also at Baalbek, of the use of sewing machines by the Romans. Now we're talking about a time probably later than that of the construction of the Trilytheum, but I don't think it's entirely outside of the realm of possibility to think that the civilizations even earlier than the Romans, even earlier than classical antiquity, could have developed the kind of machines used for manufacturing these huge, massive stone. Now, what I also find very fascinating, and I think there is lots of evidence for this, particularly in places like Peru, in Egypt, as well in Mexico, is the more, I would say, exotic techniques for processing and working with stones. They may involve the application of very intense energy on the stone. This is something that left a very different type of marks, or the absence of tool marks on stone. Like you find in Peru, for instance, where you have evidence of stone vitrification, you have evidence of stones that appear to have been molten or softened. So that would require us to assume a very different type of technology. It is just the use of a mechanical method that may require the use of energy technology of some sort that we don't yet understand how that was accomplished.
What is the evidence or results that you see in stone that would make you feel that some kind of energy was used in cutting? Is it the finished kind of line, or perhaps the surface is smooth, like there was a great heat which caused vitrification or whatever?
Yeah, I think there are a number of instances of these. So you find it, for instance, in Peru, and I know you have been at many of the sites down there in Peru, at Ollantaytambo, at Sacsayhuaman. You find very specific, very peculiar marks on the stone, like scoop marks, for instance.
Yeah.
On places where the stone appears to have been softened with like impressions that look almost like handprints in the stone, as if the stone had been in a sort of plastic state where it could be manipulated. So that's one. The other example I would refer to is sites like Tiwanaku. We now have another example in Mexico, San Miguel Ixtapan, for instance, where you have these stones that appear to have been almost cast in a mold. So that goes back again to the idea of the geopolymer.
Yeah.
Geopolymer, of course, is one hypothesis, one possibility, but then you also have this alternative hypothesis that if you could soften the stone, that you can literally like print on that stone. So having sort of mold, or having a sort of pattern that you could quite literally stamp or print on the stone to create these very intricate, very precise geometric carvings on the rock.
Yeah, that's fascinating to think of. One of the areas that has always been a confounding issue for me is the fact that if there have been earlier civilizations that were gone because of asteroid hit or geological changes or environmental changes, we don't know. A lot of theory of the Maya is that at their height, the living situation got so bad in places like the Guatemala, Honduras, that the civilization eventually died out. I don't know if that's true or not. We have no idea. We have no records of it. But one of the big issues that keeps coming up, and this is what some of the features areas of ancient apocalypse has, is the fact that these places are lived in by different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And you follow Earth Ancients a lot. You know Dr. Mark Carlotto's theory.
Mm-hmm.
You know Mario Bilrep's. Mario goes and says that the earliest temples are 400,000 years old. Carlotto says Chichen Itza, the El Castillo, is 270,000 years old. Now, when we go that far back, it's hard to know where the initial building is and what's been modified. So isn't that the big challenge, is to understand how far to go back? And, you know, this is some of your sweet spots, Marco. How do we deal with that?
Yeah.
Because, you know, and my second part of that question is, archaeologists just don't want to go back. They're really challenged by going way, 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 way back. And when you say 100,000 years, if you say more than 5 or 6,000 years, they begin having a challenge. But what do you say about that?
Yeah, no, I would say that in order to make this type of claims, and I'm of course very familiar with the research of Mark, who is a very good friend, and with Mario Bildraps that you mentioned. I think when you make this type of claims, you need to have some very strong evidence to back it up. Now, I think to give credit, particularly to Mark, whose research I say I respect, I admire a lot. What he's saying is not that these sites are 100,000 or 200,000 years old, because there is just no, or at least we haven't found yet the archaeological evidence for that. What he's saying is that their orientation is compatible with the location of previous poles positions. So what that means is that there is also the possibility that these sites were oriented as they are in a ceremonial way, as a way of connecting with what was the location or the position of or a previous pole position in a former world age. So there may be some symbolic reasons behind that, which does not necessarily mean that these sites are 100,000 or 200,000 years old. It's almost like when you have, for instance, like most mosques, even today, they're all oriented towards Mecca. Like if for a moment you assume you have no idea why a mosque is oriented as such, then you will probably come up with all kinds of different hypotheses. That becomes a ritual orientation, right, for these sites. It's very similar with many of these megalithic sites. They kept some sort of orientation for ritualistic purposes or as a way of connecting to this idea of a lost golden age. But that doesn't necessarily mean that these sites are that old. Now, that does not imply that some of these sites may be actually much older than what they are believed to be. And you bring up this excellent point about many of these sites having been continuously rebuilt by different civilizations. That's what you find. It's just a stratification, many different layers of culture, many different layers of civilization. And that's, I think, the most interesting part, one of the most fascinating arguments in favor of this idea of an ancient lost civilization is the fact that the earliest layers are by no means the most primitive. They are, in fact, in many cases, the most complex, the most sophisticated. This is something you find, for instance, Göbekli Tepe. So how do you explain this apparent paradox of the fact that the farther you go back in time, it's not that things are getting simpler or more formative, things are actually getting more complex, as if what you're looking at is not a linear evolution, but rather a descent of civilization from a higher state down to a more primitive state.
What would you say is the demise of the most recent civilization? You could call it I mean, because in your book, The Empires of Atlantis, you actually discuss the phases, the earliest phase, a couple 100,000 years, and then the middle, and then the end phase. Would you say the last epoch was Atlantean, this maritime civilization that basically traveled the world? Or is Atlantis one of many civilizations, say, prior to 9,500 BC?
Yes. So something that I suggest and I propose in the book is this idea that Atlantis did not sink in a single day and night. That civilization spanned thousands, possibly tens of thousands of years. And as that Atlantic island became increasingly unstable, that triggered various waves of migration on both sides of the Atlantic. So what they suggest is that there was not just one wave of arrivals, one wave of refugees from Atlantis towards the end of the Younger Dryas, but the process of sinking of the Atlantean landmass did in fact continue well into the Neolithic period. I suggest even as late as the European Bronze Age, so we'll be talking about the first millennium BC, which is when we may trace some of these latest migrations from Atlantis in the form of the Sea People invasions, for instance, in Europe. And I do suggest the possibility of the equivalent of a Sea People invasion also on the American continent, where waves of migrants, refugees from Atlantis may have reached the American continent, may have reached Mesoamerica, perhaps as recently as 2000, 1000 BC, and gave rise in turn, or at least like helped in the rise of some of these Mesoamerican civilizations, starting with the Olmecs and then with the pre-classic and classic Mayas.
That's a different look at it. Why do you think that the American archaeological community has such a huge problem with ancient civilizations? I mean, my feeling, because I've been going to Mexico for almost 30 years, if they had the amount of ruins that are found in Mexico, perhaps their being able to excavate a pyramid or a civic area from a lost or a very old civilization like the Maya, like the Aztec, wouldn't that help them broaden their perspective? They are, I mean, it's like, I think, and I want your opinion about this, Marco. It seems to me that Mexican and South American archaeologists are much more open to the possibilities of a very, very, very old civilization as perhaps the original people, and then down through the ages, resettlement.
Yeah, and they are in fact, and of course you have to keep in mind that archaeology is a very conservative discipline, almost by definition. So, in order to realize a change of paradigm of the kind that would be required to acknowledge the existence of a prehistoric lost seafaring civilization, that requires a pretty extraordinary amount of evidence. However, I would say there are definitely many archaeologists, not only in Mexico, in the Latin American countries, but even within American mainstream academia, that are increasingly pushing the boundaries of what we know. One great example, I know you have had him a couple of times on the podcast, is Richard Hansen, for his research in the Mirador Basin. That's a pretty extraordinary research that shows that a developed, sophisticated Maya civilization existed almost 1,000 years before it was until then believed possible that civilization even existed in the Petén region. He has been uncovering these enormous pyramids at sites like El Mirador, Tintal, and Nakbe that date back to 600 BC, which is, again, a full 1,000 years before the flourishing of the classic Maya civilization. Again, you may take these as like small steps, but these are steps that go in the right direction of constantly pushing back the origins of civilization.
So, I mean, Hansen's rare, and we've had Ed Barnhart, Dr. Barnhart, who excavated Palenque. He's much more transparent and willing to be open to the possibilities. But I mean, they frankly can't stand Graham Hancock. And I think Graham kind of sets his own table in many ways, because he's almost flagrantly waving the flag like, you know, Atlantis happened. Get used to it, which isn't really the way to go. And I don't think at this point he cares anymore if he's offending the archaeological community. But it would be nice if we found a codice or a document or a stele or something that said, hey, Atlantis existed, and by the way, these are the dates. It'd make it a lot easier, don't you think?
Yeah, I think that's everybody's dream. And by the way, I do think that the archaeologist who finds that will probably become the most famous archaeologist in the world. So I do think there is also an incentive in this way. It's not that I don't think there is a censorship or anything like that, but definitely funding doesn't flow in that direction. I think, as I said, archaeology is a very conservative discipline, so we get lots of funding going into doing more of the same. And very little funding going.
Very good point.
Really like breakthrough transformative research.
Yeah, you hit it on the nose, Marco. It's all about funding. It's all about following in line with previous archaeologists, and people like Michael Cole. Even though he passed on many years ago, or a few years ago, I should say, his doctrine still holds a lot of water. So
look, Michael Coe, for instance, was also revolutionary in a way, in the sense that at some point towards the end of his career, he was quite openly advocating for the idea of transoceanic contact with Central America. He talks very openly about the similarities between the Mayas and the Khmer and the Angkor in Cambodia, for instance. So that's going back like to what I was saying about, I think it's hard to generalize. I think there are archaeologists that are, of course, much more open to these kind of hypotheses, but then academia in general is a pretty conservative bunch.
Yeah, the conservative is the term to consider when we think of Orthodox archaeologist. I want to mention one thing in this series, Ancient Apocalypse. Graham spends a great deal of time in Cholula, which is the largest,
Mhm.
one of the largest pyramids. And at some point, we get to see a number of stages of Cholula from its very early period into where what we see today, which is basically a mountain of dirt with a cathedral at the top. How far back, and I don't remember if there was a date from the individual who was with Graham, but it's amazing that they were able to find these earlier editions of Cholula. When I mean, do we know how far back the original structure goes? How many thousands of years?
Well, it seems, at least as far as we know, the earliest structure on the site was probably built around 600 BC. So that's the earliest dated structure. However, it's also been shown that this structure was built on top of some previous sacred site,
Oh,
probably a natural water source or a natural cavern. And we don't know for how long people actually worshipped at the site before then. Only thing we know is that in 600 BC, somebody built a pyramid, a very early pyramid still, at the site of Cholula. And then over the following centuries or thousands of years, that pyramid grew into becoming one of the largest monuments on Earth.
yeah. And I mean, we're talking some serious number of man hours to build the final pyramid. That thing is just gigantic. That's an important example of very, very early settlers in Mexico, in Central America, and then over preceding centuries, different groups coming and settling. Now, I had a chance, and I think I mentioned this to you, or if not, you probably heard it on the program. We got a chance to meet with Sergio Gomez at Teotihuacan and go under the Plum Serpent Pyramid. One of the funny things, and I want your opinion on this, Marco. I never asked you this. They found two access points to this tunnel underneath this pyramid, and the original one that Gomez found was a structured cement and stone well, which I'm writing about right now in this new book, is an access for water. This thing, and we showed the channels delivering water and then passing it down. That's where Gomez found this tunnel. But when they used the ground penetrating radar, a few yards behind that is the access point that the Teotihuacans used to fill with their grave goods and things.
Mhm.
So right there, it says to me that the Teotihuacans weren't the original people, because the design of the structure was this open well, and then the pyramid and the whole complex. And then here's a later phase, these people coming and putting their grave goods in this site. What doesn't that spell a unique possibility that there's an earlier people that built Teotihuacan?
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. And I do think that even if we stick to what is the known history of the site, that spans around 1,000 years almost. So during that time period, clearly many of these sites were reused by later inhabitants of Teotihuacan. Actually, some of my research is also focused on the pyramid of the feather serpents, where there is evidence of very large megalithic construction at the site in the form
That's
of
right.
very
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
perfectly carved stone blocks. They're just scattered around. Some of these were reused in the Teotihuacan construction, but at this point, we have no way of telling whether these were part of some pre-existing structure that was then dismantled or they were brought there from somewhere else. What we know is that these huge stone blocks were reused in the Teotihuacan period to create the filling of these massive pyramids. So that would be another example of the reuse of earlier structures at Teotihuacan.
Yeah, you brought that to my attention, and when we were out there a couple of years ago, the caretakers of the archaeological park there at Teotihuacan have made them little statues, little idols. They popped them up on like stone supports so that they're not moved, but they're all over around
Mhm.
the outer portion of that plum serpent pyramid. And you're suggesting that they were part of another building, or maybe they were part of the actual pyramid itself.
Yes, yes. So what they do suggest is that some of these blocks may be part of an earlier megalithic architecture that existed perhaps long before the pyramids of Teotihuacan were constructed. There were some megalithic structures that were later reused, repurposed, in some cases just plainly dismantled by the later builders of Teotihuacan. Now, we don't know how much earlier all these existed there, but it could be centuries, it could be thousands of years earlier.
Yeah.
But I do believe there is definitely a megalithic layer of Teotihuacan that has not yet fully been studied and uncovered.
Let me ask you, you have a body of your organization that you co-founded, ARX Project, which, by the way, stands for Archaeology, Research, and Exploration.
Mhm.
And I've seen, and you've delivered some fascinating three-dimensional scans of megalithic stones. Would it be worthwhile to image all of these remaining pieces that are around this pyramid and try to put them together like a big puzzle?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that would be amazing. That would be amazing. We would of course need the authorization to do that. We haven't applied for permits for authorization at Teotihuacan, but we have done something similar at other sites in
Yeah.
Mexico. One of those being San Miguel Ixtapan, where we have found literally dozens of these perfectly carved, huge megalithic stone slabs of unknown provenance. Of an unknown function that we have now been scanning, documenting in 3D to understand more about how they were created, and also potentially reconstruct what their original appearance would have been like.
Yeah. It seems like you do this every 6 months. You find one of these megalithic stones out in some farmer's field, and you get just enough money to pull it together, and then you build a little sanctuary for it, which I
Yeah.
find is just amazing. Is
It
that
does.
all ARX that's
Yes,
funding that?
yes. It's all funding. Part of what we are doing there, of course, working in partnership with the local authorities, with the National Institute of Anthropology,
Yeah.
is help the conservation of these artifacts. As you say, so many of these incredible megalithic slabs, they are found in the fields by farmers in some cases. They're getting broken up, destroyed, or they get just simply reused as construction materials by those people that at the end of the day, they do not know, they ignore the value of these artifacts. And so part of our job is to help the preservation of these slabs. Whenever a new one is found, and now it's been already like two that we have recovered, we have brought to a protected area. This last one was found at a site called San Francisco Los Nopales, and we brought it to a structure that we built. It's a cement, it's a concrete structure where this lab is going to be exhibited and put on display there. So it's going to be protected, preserved, and everyone can see it.
Yeah. Talk real quickly before we go on to Project Laoba. What is the defining characteristics of these stones? It looks to me that not only is it very, very smooth, so either the cutting device was very high heat, but there's also framing that is almost a distinction on these pieces. They're both kind of the same period almost, or I should say the same technology. Talk about the unique qualities of this stonework.
Yeah, they all follow the same pattern, the same design, as if they were created literally with a mold. And we have found, as I said, over a dozen of these labs already, but there are probably still many more that are constantly being found at the site. And what is remarkable is the fact they are carved in very hard stone. It's basalt, it's andesite, with very precise right angles, perfectly flat surfaces. So that's part of the enigma in a region like the southern part of the state of Mexico. It is not known to have been home to any really like sophisticated or advanced civilization could have created that type of artifacts. The other remarkable characteristic is their similarity, and I would say it's more than a similarity. They're quite identical to artifacts from Tiwanaku, from Pumapunku in South America, in Bolivia. It's exactly the same type of stonework, exactly the same type of geometric design and patterns. So it's not surprising that the very first archaeologists that studied the site in the 1950s, they claimed that there was some sort of connection or influence from South America there, because it's exactly the same you find in Peru and Bolivia.
It's funny. I'm trying to think of the early archaeologists, Prononsky or
It was Charles Wiki and Modi Bullington. It was two American archaeologists.
but I'm talking about
Oh,
Bolivia.
Yes, Poznański. Artur
Poznański. He dates, and of course he got slammed for it. He dates that area to something like 12 to 20,000 years ago.
Yeah, it's like 15,000 years, and of course, like lots of these dates have been challenged, but I think many of the arguments of Poznański are pretty solid. But the idea that Tiwanaku was originally a seaport, there is, in fact, up to, if I remember correctly, I think it talks about 3 cities built one on top of each other, the earliest of which is the one it dates to 15,000 years ago. By the way, this is a layer that archaeologists have barely scratched at Tiwanaku. Now, when we consider that the style of these slabs from San Miguel Ixtapan is identical to Tiwanaku stonework, there of course also prompts the question as to what civilization created them and when were they created. Only thing we know about these San Miguel Ixtapan slabs is that they're old, like very old. They are probably pre-classic, at least pre-classic, I would say, in origin. They're actually found reused in some pyramids, in some other pre-Hispanic structures at the site. But in the absence of a proper archaeological context or radiocarbon dating, it's very hard to assign them a date. My belief is that they're at least pre-classic, meaning at least contemporary with the Olmecs, or possibly even older than
1200 BC or older.
Or older, exactly.
Okay. I mean, I've followed the discoveries of these stone pieces that you have been promoting. They're like parts of a wall, parts of a building, could be parts of a temple. I mean, the next question I have is, Marco, let's get some LiDAR, scan that surface. Of course, that costs money.
We're gonna do that. We're gonna do that, and that's a great mystery. Where do these slabs come from?
Yeah.
We have found them in all kinds of contexts, always out of place. Like they were reused in later periods of time. They were probably considered as a sort of relic by later people, by later civilizations that came there. So they reused them. They brought them into their temples, set them up on an altar. But their origin is ultimately unknown. My belief is that they probably came from some sort of edifice, some sort of a megalithic structure. And there is evidence that these slabs would go together. They were part of a sort of architectural monumental facade, but they were all connected to each other. The fact they are exactly identical, they have the same type of carving, suggests that they were part of some architectural unity, some building that really fell into ruins, and part of the stonework, part of these objects were recovered, reused by later civilization. But as you mentioned, LiDAR, this is actually part of what we want to do. We actually now submitted a research proposal for the site of San Miguel Ixtapan that aims to do a complete mapping of the site using LiDAR, potentially using geophysical methods, to really understand what is there, what may still lie buried. We know for a fact that there are dozens of mounds, there are probably buried pyramids at the site, where you can find many more of these remarkably carved stone blocks just lying around or just immediately below the surface. So that really suggests there is a whole city buried at that site of San Miguel Ixtapan.
And that's opening up a can of worms, because once you see it and you find it, then it's like, how do we access it? And where do we get the resources to access it?
Yes, that's always the issue.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about Project Lioba. It is a real fascination of mine. I had a chance to visit Oaxaca and the Mitla temple. I didn't go inside. I didn't get a chance to do much, but give us the basics. And for those of you listening, at the end of this, we're going to give you some information on ARX Project, which funds all this research that Marco and his team are working with. But talk a little bit about what you discovered going all the way back to Father Francisco de Bayoga.
Uruguay, yes. So Project Lioba is our latest research at Mitla, Oaxaca. As I say, it's a fascinating archaeological site. There's this remarkable megalithic architecture, perfectly cut stone mosaics, stone surfaces. Now, legends speak of subterranean labyrinth at Mitla that was considered by the ancient Zapotec people to be an entrance to the underworld. In the 17th century, Father Francisco de Burgos describes in very remarkable detail this subterranean labyrinth. He speaks about 4 subterranean chambers connected to this vast underground cavern, which he says run for miles underneath the site, which contained the tombs of the high priest, the tombs of the kings of Teotihuacan, and once again was considered by the ancient inhabitants to be an entrance to the underworld. They actually brought sacrifices into this cavern. It was probably the reason why Mitla was built where it is, because of the presence of these natural cavern that was then expanded with the addition of more subterranean chambers, tunnels, and passageways. Now, all of these, according to Burgos, was sealed by Spanish priests in the 16th century. So
let me stop you real quickly. And a lot of people don't understand this. Why, and I want you to explain this real quickly, why would the Spanish, and we see this in downtown Mexico City, why would they cover up these temples and these pyramidal structures? And why would they disassemble them? Wouldn't they want to preserve the integrity of the early people?
No, I think it was quite the opposite. So what they wanted to achieve was to basically eradicate what they consider to be pagan beliefs, and of course, like eliminating, replacing all these very ancient traditional beliefs with the faith of the Catholic Church. So it's only obvious that they would build their churches, their convents on top of the ancient sacred sites as a way of exorcising like the previous cults, but also to preserve that sort of continuity, in a sense that if you are already used to go to the temple or to the pyramid to pray, and now there is a church built on top of that pyramid, then there is in a way a sort of link, a sort of connection between that sacred place that still continues to be used to serve a function as the center of the community. Now, of course, when they did that, like at Mitla, they didn't even destroy the ancient structure because they provided a very solid foundation. So what they did was to simply build their church on top. And in the case of Mitla, there is evidence that the main altar of the Catholic Church occupies the location where the entrance to this subterranean temple, to this underground labyrinth, was located.
Yeah, that's amazing. And we see this throughout Mexico, in South America, where these conquistadors traveled with the priests, and the priest's job was to convert the heathens, these pagans, as Marco calls them, and then they are disassembling pyramids, they are covering up sanctuaries and temples, and they're eradicating their culture because they don't fit in with and this is a genocidal action.
It's a process of cultural conquest that went hand in hand with military conquest.
Exactly. Let's talk now about the scanning equipment. And by the way, bravo for those of you listening. I have the recent scans up on Earth Ancients group page and also on the international page, but Marco has graciously sent some other photographs that you can see that show the actual scans themselves and the evidence of what they discovered. So talk about the equipment and the team that was assembled to do this.
So the project was the result, or is the result, of a collaboration between the Mexican National Institute of History and Anthropology, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and the ARX Project, the ARX Association for Archaeological Research and Exploration. So We conducted this project, this research, with all the required permits and authorization from the INA and from the Mexican authorities. This is very important to mention.
We should also say real quickly that you had some INA archaeologists on this project too.
Absolutely. We had several INA archaeologists. We have a whole team of geophysical scientists from the National University of Mexico that employ this state-of-the-art geophysical equipment that includes ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and seismic scan tomography to literally see below the ground of Mitla. Now, the reason why we use these geophysical methods is that being a historic site, being also a living community today, it's going to be very hard to conduct excavations there unless you have some very specific evidence of what may exist underneath the ground. That's the reason why we employ these non-invasive geophysical methods to create a complete image of what lies below the ground. Now, what the scans show is the presence of a very extensive network of subterranean chambers located underneath the church, exactly in the same location where Father Burgoa in the 17th century described this subterranean labyrinth of Lioba. And some of the images I share with you, what they show is in fact several different chambers and passages, but most importantly is two chambers located directly underneath the church. There's one massive chamber that measures approximately 15 by 10 meters, or around 45, 50 feet by 30 feet, located directly underneath the church at a depth of between 3 and 6 meters, that is to say between 10 and 20 feet under the ground. That chamber is also connected by means of what looks like a vertical shaft to what appears to be a natural cavern. What we could see in the geophysical scan, which again is almost like a limited cut, we could only go down to a certain depth, but is what looks like the entrance of a cavern that appears to extend in an east-west direction down to a depth of 18 meters. So 18 meters or approximately 60 feet below ground. We do not know how far that cavern extends, but that matches the description that Father Burgoa gave of the cavern of Lioba as these subterranean chamber or network of chambers connected to a vast underground cavern that was considered to be an entrance to the underworld.
Do we know when the Spanish placed the church on top of this temple?
Yes, it was built sometime around 1570. We don't have the exact date of construction, but we know it was sometime around the end of the 16th century.
But when Padre Francisco gets and starts describing the details, does he say that the entrance to the labyrinth is covered by this church?
It doesn't say that specifically. Now, remember that Burgoa wrote almost a century after the facts. Burgoa was the general inquisitor of Oaxaca at the time, and in writing a history of the province of Oaxaca, he had access to documents of the Dominicans of the Inquisition in Oaxaca. So what he relates is based on documents that were already by then 100 years old. He doesn't say exactly where the entrance to this subterranean labyrinth was located. And that's the reason why we went to scan different parts of the site. Now, the church was a very obvious location because of everything they were just discussing. So the fact that the Spanish would always rebuild on top of earlier sacred sites. So if there was a really important temple in Mitla, it only makes sense to believe that the church was built directly on top of that.
It's so funny. The Catholic Church in Mexico is still very powerful and very focused. How do they feel about you digging, and what would they say to you if you said, hey, we want to remove your floor and we want to use this as an access point to this discovery?
Now, I think we need to be, of course, very, very respectful of the fact that the church is still an active cult place. It's really the center of the community of Mitla. So that's part of the reason why we used these non-invasive geophysical methods. Now, the idea is that hopefully in a second phase of the project we're kicking off right now, we should be able to identify additional access points that would not require conducting any type of excavation in or around the church. This is actually something that is strongly suggested by the geophysical scans. This network of chambers and tunnels actually extends far beyond the church. There are tunnels that extend in the northern direction, in an eastern direction, in the southern direction. So we want to identify potential access points that may be more easily accessible without disturbing the church and the historic buildings and the colonial structures.
Okay. Now, throughout your paper, you use the word labyrinth.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think of a labyrinth, I'm thinking of multiple rooms, multiple corridors, it could be multiple levels, like there's one level and then you go down 10, 20 feet at a second level. How deep did the equipment scan, and what can you tell us about what was discovered in what you would consider a labyrinth portion
Yes.
of this discovery?
So the equipment, particularly the seismic survey, could scan down to a depth of around 18 meters, or about 60 feet below ground. So that's the resolution that we had. And what we could see is that those passageways, they extend farther down. So we couldn't see how far down because that was the limit of the technology. But we know for a fact that they continue farther down. So there may be other levels below. They also seem to extend beyond the area that was surveyed with geophysical methods. Now, I use the word labyrinth because that's the word also used by Bourgois when he talks about this system, this underground subterranean temple. He talks about 4 chambers that were clearly constructed below ground, but then he talks about the cavern itself, the cavern of Lioba. And when he describes the cavern, he describes it, and then quoting literally from Bourgois' work, as a confusing labyrinth. What he says is that this cavern had what seems to have been like a main tunnel or a main passage that was intersected by several passageways, several perpendicular passageways. He actually describes that as the streets of a city, as a sort of like grid-like pattern in which you had one main tunnel that was intersected by other passageways. This is a very interesting aspect of Bourgois' description, because even though he talks about the cavern, his description suggests that this may be in fact an artificial constructed space, because he describes it being intersected at regular intervals by side passageways. He describes the roof being supported by massive pillars as well. So that suggests that this is in fact either an artificial constructed space or a space that was artificially modified. The other part of Bourgois' account is when he talks about these priests going down into the cavern and then coming back after a while for fear of getting lost, because there were so many passageways, tunnels, side chambers, that even though, and Bourgois states that even though they brought a rope down there, they were afraid that their torches would run out and they would be lost forever in this labyrinth under the ground. So that's when they decided to get out and completely block and seal the entrance to the subterranean.
That's fascinating that they would write about that. This is going to be a challenge because you mentioned that the entrance to this labyrinth is the main church. They built the main cathedral or the main meeting area above this. Is your next phase to use a drone, a remote vehicle to image this passageway?
Yes, so this is a part of the plans for, I would say, probably a third phase of the project. Right now, in this second phase, we're kicking off in September. We want to extend the research perimeter, as I said, to identify potential access points. So we want to document and scan the area also around the church, involving some of the other ancient groups of structures at the site, to identify potential connection with other subterranean chambers, with other passageways. After that, once we have created a full map and identified these potential access points, what we would like to do in the third phase is to drill some small holes into these chambers, enough to insert a small endoscopic camera, similar to what was done at Giza recently with this newly discovered passageway on the north face of the Great Pyramid, to see what is inside those chambers. So that will be the goal of a future phase of the project, to actually access those chambers, gather images, gather data on the structure of the chambers, their contents, as a preparation then for a potential exploration of these subterranean spaces.
You only show a few of the scan resolutions and details. Is the scan sensitive enough to show the patterns on the wall that we see on the surface?
No, I wish it was. Unfortunately, the resolution of the scan is a little bit over 1 meter. So anything that is more than 1 meter would not even show up, which means there may be even more passages, more tunnels. But if their section is just about 1 meter or smaller, they wouldn't even show up. So everything that shows up are things that are larger than 1 meter in section, be it like in width or in height. Now, to get to that level of precision, that's when we will need to actually insert a camera to get a sense of the geometry of this space and also the contents, right? So we don't know if these chambers still contain things like mummies, like burials, as suggested by Burgoa, some ceremonial objects. So we have no idea what may be still inside those chambers after 400 years.
Let's project about 5 years. Say you find a labyrinth, you find burials, you find a lot of artifacts. How do we get access to this site? Would another area would be open so people could access it? How do you, because you're not going to dig up the cathedral. The church is going to have a fit.
Yeah, well, that would be for really like to access those chambers. I believe that would be the most important discovery in Mesoamerican archaeology in well over a century, perhaps ever. So that would dwarf any other discovery in Mesoamerica, including the tomb of Pakal in Palenque, including these newly discovered tunnels in Teotihuacan. So here we're talking about an entire network of massively megalithic stone-built chambers at depths of over 60 feet below the ground, containing an unknown amount of artifacts, burials from the Zapotec period. They may well turn out to be hundreds, possibly thousands of years old. So that would be probably one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of all time, so I would say.
But what you, Marco Vigato, what is, it's exciting as hell what you're doing, but how do we get this into the average Joe who wants to visit Oaxaca, and Mitla is on the itinerary, but more than just walking around the outdoor courtyards? And how would Ina create, the bottom line is making a buck on it too, so tourism is huge.
Well, there are different ways, of course, and that everything will depend on the state in which we find these chambers, how solid, how safe it is. Like, we have no idea at this point. But I do think if at least the known subterranean chambers at Mitla serve as a reference, we do expect to find some massively built megalithic stone chambers underneath the church. So there is, of course, the hope that these may be opened up to the public, as some of the other subterranean chambers at Mitla are already. Now, they were closed during COVID, but there are certainly plans to reopen some of these chambers. That may take a while before the general public is allowed into these chambers, but I think that's would definitely be the plan, and maybe not the general opening, but just allowing small groups into those chambers. I think that would be definitely a possibility. Now, the other possibility I find is even more fascinating from just an access point of view, is creating a complete 3D model replica of these chambers. So creating a virtual reality experience with photogrammetry data in which everyone can virtually explore these chambers.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Did you have a chance to see the Italian scientists satellite scan of the Khufu pyramid.
Yes,
Now that
fascinating.
acoustic technology would be perhaps applicable for what you're looking at. Wouldn't that
Mhm.
make your life easy if you could use a technology like that to pierce a couple 100 feet under the ground to get a good swatch, a good image of this labyrinth?
Um, yeah, it would be faster, but it wouldn't get us the required resolution, meaning that the methodologies that were employed they were employing with seismic scan, electrical resistivity, ground penetrating radar. They provide a very good resolution.
Of
Again, it's not
course.
enough to see the decorations on the walls, as you
Yeah.
say, but it's a good enough resolution for what we're looking for. Now, those satellite techniques, they typically have a resolution which is much lower than what we have. Of course, it's faster. We can cover a larger area. So this is certainly something that we would entertain for just like mapping the site to a greater depth and over a larger area, but acknowledging the trade-off with a lower resolution.
Okay. Help me out real quickly. This is the Church of San Pablo,
Mhm.
which is where this is held. This is
Yes.
what you or Ina has identified as the church group
Mhm.
of
Right.
Mitla.
Yes.
There's other
Mhm.
regional areas.
Yes.
What's unique about the other areas? I mean, the church has the labyrinth, which is huge. That's
Mhm.
your main focus, and your research dollars are there. But what do the other sites show us?
Mhm. Yes. So one of the other groups of structures that we investigated with geophysical methods is the columns group, which is probably the most famous, the most iconic structure at Mitla. These are beautifully preserved ancient with stone mosaics on the facades. So that's probably, as I said, the most iconic structure at Mitla. That building we also scanned. We didn't find any evidence of subterranean chambers there. But what we did find is evidence of a buried stairway underneath the platform. What that means is that there is an earlier construction, an earlier stage of the columns palace that was later built over by the Zapotecs or by the Mixtecs in the 12th century AD, which is also a very important discovery because that shows that Mitla was already an important site, an important ceremonial center, probably centuries before the time of its apogee in the 10th or 11th century AD.
Were the Zapotecs pyramid builders? I mean, we
Yes.
see up on the hill there, we have that one site. Yeah, Montalban.
Mhm.
Yeah, I love that place. But did you? This is a question I've had for when I was looking at this. You mentioned the column group. Does this labyrinth have these columns underneath? Do you see columns in this
Well,
underground?
again, we don't have the resolution
Oh,
to identify
pretty
substructures or
pretty
columns,
raw.
but Burgoa he speaks of the roof of these cavern, what he calls a cavern, as being supported by massive pillars. So it's quite possible. Actually, one of the subterranean chambers that have been explored at Mitla and that was opened in the late 1800s, it has a column in the center supporting the roof. So it's quite possible that these chambers will also contain columns or pillars. Otherwise, it's quite hard to imagine how chambers as big as what has been revealed by geophysical scan, like measuring 15 by 10 meters, would just be able to support the weight of the roof and the ground above.
This is so fascinating, and it must be exciting for you. I mean, I don't know how you can sit still. You want to go out and dig and find more stuff.
I do.
What resistance, if any, are you facing in this excavation? Is Ina on board 100%?
Mhm. Yeah.
The local university is on board, and of course, the most important thing is the Catholic Church on board.
I think everyone from the INA, the National University of Mexico, they are fully committed to the project. They've been fully on board and extremely supportive of this research, which would not have been possible, of course, without their support and their leadership, really. In the case, as you mentioned, the local community, I think the local community, the church, they have raised a number of concerns about the project, the risk that would pose to the structure. So, as I said, we have to be extremely careful, extremely respectful of the fact that we're talking about an archaeological site, but we're also talking about a living community there.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, respecting their beliefs, respecting the importance they also attribute to the site is going to be key. And of course, we want to work, and we're working in very close contact with the local community. We are making sure that all the findings, they get published, they get communicated, presented to the local community. We just had a few weeks ago a public presentation in Mitla with the local community, in which we presented all the results from the geophysical scan. There is now a project to create a museum at Mitla where many of the finds, many of the artifacts recovered in the excavations will be put on display for the local community. And of course, they also see the benefit that tourism can bring to the area with this increased attention, all the publicity that the site is receiving.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that at some point, perhaps an access to these chambers would be made available. Obviously, they'd have to make sure it's completely safe, but this would be a very important site for tourism, for also archaeological research to learn about the ancient past, right?
Okay, that will be the equivalent for Mexico as the discovery Tutankhamun's tomb was for Egypt.
You really think so?
I do think so.
Wow, amazing. One last thing, and then we're going to move on. Looking at the images coming back from the scanning tech, and you've traveled enough places in Europe, can you comfortably compare the architecture, the composition, the layout to any other place that you've been?
Well, I think again at Mitla, particularly in the subterranean chambers, at least the very small subterranean chambers that we know that are known from the 1800s excavations, what you find is there is a very precision stonework, very precisely cut stone monoliths, as you find in many other megalithic sites around the world. There's also then the question of the stone mosaics at Mitla with these so-called grecas, which are these geometric patterns on the walls, some of which they have, of course, I think a strong similarity with similar patterns you find in other parts of the world, in Mediterranean world, for instance. So again, you may take these as more evidence, perhaps, of a global seafaring culture of prehistoric antiquity.
I have to mention this, though. The series of photos that you sent me remind me of Malta.
It does.
The stonework reminds me of Malta.
The spirals, the stonework, for sure.
Yeah, big slabs stacked on top of each other. Yes. Kind of very raw, but also there's a light finish. Something is very, very unusual about that. And that's why I ask you if you felt that what we see at San Pablo is reminiscent of other temples that you've been to in other parts of Europe.
It does. It actually gave me a very similar feeling to when I went down to the Hypogeum in Malta, like that kind of megalithic stonework, as you see, also like the patterns, these spiral designs, this geometric pattern. There is of course, I think like a very strong similarity, even in the use of these spaces, the cult of the death that was practiced, maybe like the ceremonial function, the role of acoustic and sound in these subterranean space. I think there is a lot that could be said about analogies in function and architecture and technique between these sites.
You got to watch out, though, my friend, because when we start talking about diffusion, where we're having other cultural exchanges and stuff like that, the traditionalists just have a cow. In fact, that was one of my issues with Michael Cole, is the great Mayanist, is that he didn't think there was a blueprint for pyramid cultures. And the Maya and some of the pyramids found in Southeast Asia are very similar, but he was not able to consider any kind of cultural exchange. So I guess you have to just allow your Orthodox archaeologists to find things and make their own decisions, right? You can't, I mean, obviously Ina has, traditionalist points of view, right?
And as I said, I think Michael Cope particularly towards the end of his career, I think was much more open to this possibility of transoceanic contact, the influence and the analogies, the similarities you find between Mexico, Cambodia, for instance. Quite recently, another important archaeologist, Carol Miller, she also published research in which she suggests a connection between the Olmec and the Shang Bronze Age China. So there is I do think more of an opening, even within academic circles, to considering this kind of unorthodox hypothesis.
I love it. That's what we're all about here. Of course, it makes it really easy when they find a codex or a book of data that basically says, yeah, we got some information from Europe, we got some information from China, and that would make it a lot easier. All right, hey, as we conclude, give us the research objectives for this next phase that's happening in the fall, the research objectives for the next phase of excavation.
Yes, so in September, we'll be kicking off the second phase of the geophysical scan of Mitla, and the objective is to expand the research area to some of the other groups of structures of the ancient site. Include two massive pyramids called the Adobe group, or the Calvario pyramid, and the South group. These are some of the oldest and most monumental structures at Mitla, where we also expect that we could find more subterranean chambers, tunnels, and possibly a connection with the passages that we detected, that we identified underneath the church. And by the way, our team was on the ground there in Mitla just a few weeks ago to present the findings from the first phase to the local community. And we, of course, also surveyed these other groups of structures to prepare for the next phase of geophysical scans and to define what the optimal setup would be. And I can tell you that in the South group, we identified the entrance of what appears to be a cave under one of the structure that does not appear in any of the published literature on the site. Now, we don't know, it looks like that cave is completely filled in, but we don't know if it extends much further under the structure, if there may be a connection with the tunnels that we have found underneath the church group extending in its southern direction. So this is something that we will hopefully find out in the second phase of the research.
When do you see bodies down in there? When do you see people getting in and looking through these labyrinth in this area?
I hope, well, my hope is that we're talking about for 1 or 2 years from now, probably more realistically, before we actually have people going down there. We'll take definitely doing some non-invasive prospection with cameras. So more realistically, I would say between 2, 3, up to 5 years.
Okay, that's not too bad. I thought you were going to say a decade. Things are just.
We hope that we can get things moving fast, provided we get enough funding and we keep, of course, the interest alive with the INA and with the institutions.
Let's talk about that right now. ARX Project is a company organization you co-founded. Again, it stands for Archaeology, Research, and Exploration. This is the funding arm of these projects. Talk a little bit about it and talk about how people can get involved.
Yes, so we're a non-profit Mexican registered research association, and our role, our involvement in Project Lioba, as well as in many other research projects in Mexico, as we're mentioning also this work at San Miguel Ixtapan with the recovery, conservation of these megalithic stone slabs, is entirely privately funded by the foundation, by the ARX Project. So there are literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of dollars that our members are putting into these research projects, countless work hours that go into that. We've also recently launched a crowdfunding campaign
excellent.
for the remaining budget that we're still missing to cover for the Mitla project, for Project Lioba. And so we hope that we'll be able to raise an additional $20,000 by the end of August, so we can kick off the second phase of the project in September. So this is really an ask, maybe for for all your listeners. If you can contribute as little as the cost of a movie ticket, I think if anyone who is listening to this podcast were to contribute as little as $10, the cost of a movie ticket to this project, will get the research fully funded for 1 year. So we've launched this fundraising campaign. It's available on a platform called Donadora, which has a number of benefits for us in Mexico. And you can also make a donation to PayPal, to Patreon, to our page, our website.
Where can people find? Can they go to arcproject.com, arxproject.com?
.org.
Oh,
yes.
.org. I'm sorry, it's
yes.
nonprofit.
arxproject.org. We also have a Facebook page, which is ARX Project MX, where you'll find some of the latest updates. And we also have a Patreon page.
And let people know, Marco, that as a member, a subscribing member, they have access to all the data, including the scans. Let them know what they get, how they can participate.
Yes, it's not only about supporting research and quite literally helping to write history. This that can become having your name associated with what could become one of the most important archaeological discoveries, certainly in Mesoamerica, possibly of all times. But you're also going to get access to a lot of resources that we have created as the ARX project, which includes, as you were mentioning, not only the research reports, but we literally have dozens of photo galleries that include thousands of images, not only of Mitla, but of many other Mesoamerican sites. We are creating a digital museum, a digital content library that includes already over 100 3D models of some of the most important Mesoamerican artifacts. We're starting now to scan entire archaeological sites to make them available in virtual reality through the platform.
Wow.
So this is a platform that is constantly expanding. It's constantly growing with new content that aims to become the largest online digital library on ancient Mesoamerica. So
I'd love it for you to charge, like, you'll be first in line to visit the labyrinth with the donation of 500 US or something like that. You can't give it away at this time, though, because you don't know what you're looking at.
The research, of course, is open for everyone. And what we offer our top sponsors, our top donors, is the possibility to actually come to Mitla with us in September, as we are there on the ground, to have an opportunity to see the research, how it is done, the geophysical scans, getting a real behind-the-scenes perspective of the research as it happens in Mitla in September.
So I didn't know that you have various levels. So you have a high level of a certain fee, and that individual at that rate gets to access the site.
There are, of course, like, we want to make all the content, all the findings available to the broader public. At the same time, we also want to recognize the contribution of exceptional donors that are supporting research with donations of hundreds or thousands of dollars. So in that case, want to give them more value for their donation, for their support they're providing to this research, by giving them some exclusive access to the site and to like behind the scene with the research team.
This is fascinating, Marco. This has been an eye-opener. Your work continues to be groundbreaking. What's going on with you? You're going to be at a conference in California in October, the CPAC. Talk a little bit about that. Are you going to be presenting this research there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I'm very excited about that. I will be at the CPAC conference in California in October, presenting not only about these findings in Mitla, but also about some of my recent research into megalithic Mexico and these ancient megalithic civilizations of Mexico. So that will be the topic of my presentation in October.
Excellent, excellent. And by the way, if you want to see Marco, that is CPAC, CPAK, I think, isn't that what it is?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes.
PAC.com.
It's the conference on recession and ancient knowledge.
And that's held in Palm Desert somewhere, one of the hotels.
Palm Springs.
Palm Springs. Okay, excellent. Anything else? How can people get more information? What's your website?
Yes, again, our website is www.arxproject.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page, which is ARX Project MX, which already has many thousands followers, and we're constantly updating with the latest research. You'll find videos, pictures, and some of the latest research reports on our Facebook page. And we also have a Patreon account for those of you who want to support our research with a recurring contribution, with a recurring sponsorship, which is ARX Project MX on Patreon.
Excellent. And by the way, if you don't have it, Marco's book, The Empires of Atlantis, is excellent. It's only been out, it's got about a year now.
Yes, less than 1 year.
Just 1 year. And it's packed full of great information, great research, and tons of photographs. So Marco, continued success. Always great to see you. And stay in touch, my friend.
Thank you so much, Cliff. Always a pleasure.